Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for turning up in such inauspicious circumstances. Tempted actually to start the talk with a well-known line from a different Shakespeare play, Henry V. We few, we happy few, we band of wet brothers. But I want to talk obviously about Macbeth, about the play you'll be seeing tonight. I had the great pleasure of watching it yesterday, of seeing it yesterday. Great job, by the way, for the cast here. I'm always very pleasantly surprised and astonished at the quality of the acting and the performance and the direction and everything else. So you're in for a treat if you're staying to watch the play. So Macbeth, a few facts about Macbeth, and I'm going to give the historical context about how we need to understand Macbeth as Shakespeare understood it, and as Shakespeare's audience understood it. But Macbeth is the second shortest of Shakespeare's plays. Only the Comedy of Errors is shorter. It's barely half the length of Hamlet. But it's actually similar to Hamlet, as we shall discuss. I sometimes see Macbeth as the anti-Hamlet. And I'll talk about that a bit later on. But I want to talk about the historical context. Macbeth was first performed in 1606. And that's just not a that's just not an unimportant date. 1606 is a crucial date because on November the 5th, 1605, was the notorious Gunpowder Plot. So Macbeth is written, if you like, in the aftermath and the shadow of the Gunpowder Plot. So we need to understand something about the Gunpowder Plot, what it was and what it wasn't. We also need to understand what was the background that led to the anger that led to the Gunpowder Plot. So first thing we need to know is that Shakespeare was a believing Catholic at a time when it was illegal to be a Catholic in England, punishable by death to be a priest, and punishable by death to hide a priest from the authorities. It was a time when there were a spy network of pretend Catholics who were betraying real Catholics to their death, particularly Catholic priests. Hamlet is basically Shakespeare venting his spleen against spies. So Shakespeare, again, the evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism, that's not the subject of this talk. So all I can say is you need to take my word for it. And if you don't want to take my word for it, then there are numerous books you can read. But I've written 3 books on the subject. The book, The Quest for Shakespeare, The Bard of Avon and the Church of Rome, gives the biographical and historical evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism. And then a second book I wrote called Through Shakespeare's Eyes, Seeing the Catholic Presence in the Plays, gives the textual evidence from the plays themselves for Shakespeare's Catholicism. So you have to take my word for that. So he was born in the early years of the reign of Elizabeth I and died in the reign of her successor, James I. Now, the England of the 1590s, when Shakespeare's writing his early plays, is an era of terrorism on the part of the state against its Catholic citizens. Shakespeare almost certainly knew well several of the Catholic martyrs, including St. Robert Southwell, the Jesuit martyr, and Anne Lyne, the woman who was hanged for hiding priests, both of whom were almost certainly close acquaintances of Shakespeare. But the Catholics were just waiting for Queen Elizabeth to die. She was an old lady. And when she died, her successor was James VI of Scotland, who would become James I of England. And although James was raised a Protestant, his mother was Mary, Queen of Scots, who had been a lifelong Catholic and considered herself a martyr for the Catholic faith when she was executed, almost certainly on Elizabeth's orders. And James had promised that he would repeal all the anti-Catholic laws and that religious liberty would be restored to the people of England upon his accession to the throne. So as Elizabeth got older, the Catholics were just holding on, knowing that she couldn't live forever, and then the happier days would follow. So in 1603, when she did die, There was a great explosion of relief and the practice of the faith. James was good to his word. Freedom was restored. Masses were being celebrated in public for the first time. Everybody, particularly the Puritan-dominated Parliament, was shocked at how many Catholics there still were after 70 years of sustained persecution. So, again, Shakespeare, what did he write at this time? He wrote his play Measure for Measure, which is arguably his most overtly Catholic play, with a Catholic religious sister as the heroine. He also wrote a play which speaks for itself. The play he wrote upon the death of Queen Elizabeth was All's Well That Ends Well. This was the view of the Catholics of England at the time. It's all's well that ends well. We have religious liberty again. James did his best, actually, to deliver on his promise. But the Puritan-dominated Parliament would not tolerate tolerance of Catholicism. And so the consequence was they basically passed a law bringing back all the anti-Catholic laws, and King James had to make a choice to defy Parliament or to surrender to Parliament. And as a political cynic, he looked at who had the most power. In England in 1603, 1604, was it the Catholics or was it the Puritans who now largely controlled Parliament? Cynically, against his conscience, he went with the Puritans. All the anti-Catholic laws came back again. Now, I want you to try to imagine the psychological impact upon the Catholic community of England. Try to put yourself in their shoes. So they had been courageously living an underground life, knowing people. Every Catholic knew people who had been executed. They knew people who had been forced into exile. They knew people who were in prison, and they lived in fear of prison themselves. And then you have this glorious about 16 months of freedom. And then the persecution returns with a young king who could rule for another 30 or 40 years. The response of many Catholics was finally to surrender. To be a recusant Catholic means you were paying, at the very least, you were paying very heavy fines, even if you were avoiding prison. Many surrendered. At the other extreme, there were the hotheads who now believed that the only answer was violence, that the only answer now was to rise up in arms against king and parliament. So some of these very angry Catholics came up with the idea of the Gunpowder Plot, which was a plot to blow up Parliament at the opening of Parliament when the king and the members of Parliament would be present, therefore eradicating the government with one terrorist act. That plot would never have succeeded if it wasn't for the fact that James's government wanted it to almost succeed. So near the very beginning of the plot, spies were running it. James's own spy network was in charge of it. That's why they got access under Parliament. That's why they got all the explosives there. Because, if you like, the government was turning a deliberate blind eye until they could catch them red-handed for the maximum impact. That's exactly what happened. These Catholics were dupes of the system. Okay, so this is the background, the backdrop. Anger, despondency, despair, surrender of the Catholics of England in 1604, 1605, the Gunpowder Plot. And then, if you like, the hand of state tyranny came down even heavier following the Gunpowder Plot. It was used as an excuse to treat all Catholics as terrorists or potential terrorists. So how does Shakespeare respond to this? Well, this period, we see him writing three of his darkest plays: Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. So I'm not going to talk now about Macbeth specifically. there was a play performed only a few months before Macbeth in London called The Tragedy of Gowrie. And it had about 2 performances and then was banned. The Tragedy of Gowrie was a real-life political event that happened only 6 years earlier, in 1600. King James, when it was 3 years before he became King of England, but as King James VI of Scotland, the so-called Gowrie conspiracy was a conspiracy to murder the king. But in actual fact, what appears to happen, the official story was the king visited the Gowrie clan, and he was up in the tower, and he screams out of the window, "I am being murdered." And his men run up the tower, and when they get there, he's still being murdered. And what happens is that the person who was trying to murder him was murdered, and so was his brother, the leaders of the Gowrie clan. King James VI owed the Gowrie clan a huge amount of money. He didn't like them. In getting rid of them, he not only got rid of his rivals, the people he didn't like or trust, he also got rid of the debt. And in compensation for the murder plot in inverted commas, he awarded himself a huge amount of the Gowrie estate's money. So, of course, many people suspected foul play. That, if you like, the real King James had a touch of the Macbeth about him. Now, we don't know who wrote The Tragedy of Gowrie. The play hasn't survived, but it was banned. But just a few months later, Macbeth appears on stage. Now, what's the connection between Macbeth and King James? Well, first of all, King James is the Scottish king. This is Shakespeare's play about a Scottish king. And Macbeth, although he's a real historical character, the name Macbeth actually means son of Elizabeth, son of Beth. And of course, this would be a huge insult to James, because his mother, of course, Mary Queen of Scots, was murdered by Elizabeth. But what Shakespeare's saying is, you are just like your predecessor. King James, you're exactly the same as Elizabeth. So let's now talk about the play itself for a while. My notes disintegrate before I get to them. So the play opens in the presence of demonic evil. And we want to see parallels here between Hamlet and Macbeth. Both plays begin with a supernatural apparition. Hamlet begins, of course, with the appearance of Hamlet's father. Hamlet is the opposite of reckless. He doesn't just believe that it's the ghost of Hamlet's father because the ghost tells him so. He believes that the ghost might be a demon telling lies. And that's why he goes to great lengths in the staging of the Mousetrap, the play within the play in Hamlet, to prove that the ghost is indeed an honest ghost in purgatory, who's actually revealed a crime of regicide, fratricide, murder, and adultery. Macbeth also has a supernatural apparition, but his apparition is demonic, where he's been told lies, damned lies, and half-truths as bait for his pride. And he succumbs. He takes the satanic bait and is hooked. So we need to see, if you like, Hamlet as an ascent in both senses of the word, A-S-S-E-N-T and A-S-C-E-N-T. Someone who begins in the slough of despond, very despondent, tempted to despair, tempted to suicide. And the only reason he doesn't commit suicide is because he knows it's a mortal sin and that life does not end with death. And however bad his situation might be, if he goes to hell, it will be worse. And throughout the course of the play, he grows through faith and reason to an acceptance and embrace of the gospel, where ultimately he lays down his life for his friends, saving Denmark, which is a euphemism for England. So in both plays, there's a supernatural superstructure. And in both plays, by the way, we can't ignore the supernatural element. The apparition is not an hallucination. In both plays, Shakespeare makes sure that the apparitions are seen by more than one person. They're objectively verified. They actually happened. They're real. The three witches are real. The ghost of Hamlet's father is real. They're supernatural beings who have reality. Lady Macbeth uses a phrase about pouring spirits in the ear. That has to remind us, or should remind us of Hamlet. Because that's, of course, how the wicked King Claudius kills Hamlet's father, by pouring poison into his ear. But the rest of the play, Hamlet, is about that other sort of poison that we could pour into people's ears. The poison of words. Poison of lies. That's exactly what Macbeth and Lady Macbeth do. They pour that spirit of evil into the ears of others to get their way. There's also Hamlet talks about putting the poison chalice to our own lips, which again, looking at parallels with Hamlet, will remind us of Queen Gertrude and King Claudius and the culmination of that play. Lady Macbeth, of course, is the anti-Mary. She's the anti-mother. She talks about dashing the brains of her own newborn babes against a rock to kill them. She's the opposite of the Blessed Virgin. Towards the end of the play, we hear about, it's actually said in Act 3, I think, a reference to those Scotsmen who are in holy exile. And again, for Shakespeare's audience, there are thousands upon thousands of Catholics who are in holy exile. And at the end of the play, one of the happy aspects of that play, the happy ending of that play, is that those holy exiles will be allowed to return home to a Scotland that's under a restoration of Catholic order. There's an invisible character in Macbeth, of course, and that's the character of the saintly King of England, King Edward the Confessor, who reigned in the 1060s. Anglo-Saxon England went out with a blaze of glory, with a saint on the throne, King Edward the Confessor, and with the apparition of the Blessed Virgin at Walsingham in 1061. So this is, again, the Catholic Shakespeare is alluding to this golden age of English history. And just as Denmark is a euphemism for England in Hamlet, Scotland, in this sense, is a euphemism for England. Not least, of course, because England is currently being ruled by the Scottish king. That's good. So, Lady Macbeth goes mad, if you like, literally, with her sleepwalking and the spot she can't, the blood she can't remove from her hands. Macbeth doesn't actually go mad. He embraces nihilism. He embraces nihilism as a philosophy. Now, of course, we could argue, of course, that all sin is a form of madness, and all heretical and erroneous ideas are a form of madness, but really it's dangerous to start calling ignorance a synonym for insanity. Basically, what's better? To go mad like Lady Macbeth, or to embrace the consequences of a refusal to follow virtue, which is the case of Macbeth? In other words, we live in an age that tells us that guilt is something that's bad. That you shouldn't have a conscience, you certainly shouldn't have a guilty conscience, because it will just make you miserable. Well, here quite clearly, having a guilty conscience is preferable then refusing to have a guilty conscience and go the way of Macbeth in the play. Again, towards the end of the play, Macduff says to him about the prophecies he believes from the devil. He says, "The angel you serve." And of course, the angel who Macbeth serves is Satan. The angel who the weird sisters serve is Satan. And of course, the other thing we have to remember about Shakespeare's so-called tragedies is that if there are various definitions of tragedies, so according to some of those definitions, they are tragedies. But one of the definitions of tragedies is an unhappy ending, whereas the definition of a comedy is a happy ending, usually in the form of a marriage. But in both Hamlet and Macbeth, order and sanity are restored after a period in which the country is ruled by murderous traitors. That's not an unhappy ending. All right, so I'm going to actually finish with picking up my very soggy book and just reading a couple of extracts from the introduction I wrote to this. This is the Ignatius Critical Edition of Macbeth, and to which I wrote the introduction. There's a couple of things I want to say about making a comparison between Macbeth and Hamlet, and then I'm going to actually end with a quote about Macbeth by the great G.K. Chesterton. So Macbeth's decay is therefore as much a decay of philosophy as it is a decay of morality. The more he thinks of himself, the less he thinks of others. And the less he thinks of others, the less he thinks of the other. That is the truth that transcends the self, ultimately, of course, God. The result is that his first thought of murder coincides with the murder of thought. I'm quoting now from Macbeth. "My thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man, that function is smothered in surmise, and nothing is but what is not." As Macbeth's pride takes pride of place on the throne of his soul, he begins to lose his sense of reality. Sin smothers reason, so that the normal function of a man's mind, which is to seek and find the truth, is smothered in surmise, until nothing is but what is not. Thus, Macbeth's nihilism, which will come to bitter and futile fruition in the final act, with his dismissal of life as a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, is seen to have its roots in the play's opening act, with his turning away from fides et ratio, faith and reason, towards infidelity and irrationality. Macbeth is thus revealed as an anti-Hamlet. Hamlet ends by defying augury. Macbeth ends by defying everything except augury. Hamlet grows in faith because he grows in reason. Macbeth loses his faith because he loses his reason. So I'm actually tempted here. Those of you that know me or know my writings will know that it's very, very seldom can I write about anything without mentioning Chesterton. It's also relatively rare that I write something without mentioning The Lord of the Rings. So Macbeth, for me, is an example of the Golemization of the self, which is the consequence of pride. Macbeth becomes Gollum in the course of the play, obsessed with nothing but possession of his own power. And just one other thing I did want to say is I meant to mention and forgot. An example of Shakespeare's brilliance in structural symmetry in writing the play, the mention of the placing of MacDonald's decapitated head takes place 23 lines into the play, Act 1, Scene 1. The pronouncement of Macbeth's decapitated head being placed on a spike is 23 lines from the end of the play. There's a beautiful symmetry and balance in all of this. And this is what Chesterton says basically about the golemization of sin, or how sin golemizes the soul, and how using Macbeth as an example of this. But of course, Macbeth is an example of what will happen to all of us if we follow that path. So this, I'm going to finish with just 2 paragraphs of Chesterton. Make a morbid decision, and you will only become more morbid. Do a lawless thing, and you will only get into an atmosphere much more suffocating than that of law. Indeed, it is a mistake to speak of a man as breaking out. The lawless man never breaks out, he breaks in. He smashes a door and finds himself in another room. He smashes a wall and finds himself in yet a smaller one. The more he shatters, the more his habitation shrinks. Gollum, shrink and shrivel. Where he ends, you may read in the end of Macbeth. For us moderns, therefore, the first philosophical significance of the play is this: that our life is one thing, and that our lawless acts limit us. Every time we break a law, we make a limitation. In some strange way, hidden in the deeps of human psychology, if we build our palace on some unknown wrong, it turns very slowly into our prison. Macbeth, at the end of the play, is not merely a wild beast, he is a caged wild beast. Thank you very much.